Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Sheviit. We are up to Perek Hey Mishnah Tet. Today's Mishnah should be Leilu Nishmat, Neria ben Tzvilana, Aranbai B'Mchato Began Eden, Amen. Rabotai, the previous Mishnayot discussed selling and lending animals and farming tools to those people who we suspect do not observe the laws of Shemitah. Today's Mishnah is going to discuss lending regular household utensils. Mash'elet isha l'chaverta hachashuda l'shviit. A woman can lend the following utensils to her friend who is suspected of violating the laws of Shemitah. And the Rav specifically says that her friend is suspected of keeping Shemitah produce after the biul deadline without performing biul, which we know that produce that not undergo the biul process is prohibited to be eaten. Now we spoke about earlier in Mishnah Gimel in this chapter, what exactly is this process of biul? Now we know a person is allowed to pick limited amounts of produce on Shemitah and keep them in his house for himself and for his family, only as long as this type of produce can still be found in the fields for other wild animals to eat. Once the species is no longer available outdoors to wild animals, he cannot keep any of that species in his house. At that point, he has to perform the process of biul, which is he gives up the right of ownership in the produce and he puts it outside his house for anybody to take. In Perek Tet, Mishnah Chet, chapter 9, Mishnah 8, the Tanaim disagree about who can take Shemitah produce after biul. Rabbi Yehuda says that it can be taken only by the poor. Rabbi Yossi says it can be taken by anybody, even the owner himself, as opposed to Shemitah produce before biul, which everyone agrees can be taken by everybody, even rich and poor. So again, specifically here, the woman's friend is suspected of keeping produce in her house, Shemitah produce, after the biul deadline. So the Mishnah says, Mash'elet isha lechaverta achashuda l'shviit. A woman can lend the following utensils to her friend who is suspected of violating the laws of Shemitah, that she keeps Shemitah produce after the biul deadline without performing biul. Nafa uchvara v'rechaim betanur. The following items she can lend: a sifter, which separates fine flour from coarse flour; a sieve, which separates chaff from grain; a mill, which grinds grain into flour; and an oven. Now, even though her friend will probably use these items to prepare forbidden Shemitah produce, she is still allowed to lend it to her. Why? Since there is a chance that she will use them for permitted purposes, you are allowed to lend it to her. And the Rav explains that the sifter can be used to count money, the sieve could be used to sift sand to use in cement, the mill could be used to grind spices, and the oven can be used to dry out bundles of flax. Now, we don't count the possibility that she will use the utensils to prepare permitted food, because the Mishnah is talking about a case where you know for sure that this woman does not have any food besides Shemitah produce. Now, even though it's very far-fetched to assume that the borrower will use the utensils for these random activities like sifting sand for cement, counting money, since there is a small chance that she will do this, a person is allowed to lend it to her, and the Mishnah is going to explain at the end that the reason Chachamim were lenient was for Darkei Shalom, to promote peace between neighbors. However, she is not allowed to sort or grind her friend's Shemitah produce together with her, because then she is directly assisting her friend in preparing forbidden produce. Now, the Mifashim explained that technically you are allowed to prepare, like grind and sift forbidden Shemitah produce. You're only prohibited from eating it. However, if you know somebody is preparing this produce in order to eat it, and you help them, you're going to be violating the isur of helping somebody transgress a prohibition. Therefore, you are not allowed to help her, even though we assume we have a far-fetched possibility she might use it for a permitted purpose. Now, the Mishnah is going to discuss now similar rulings regarding Tumah and Tara. Nothing to do with Shemitah, but Tumah and Tara. Eshet chaver masheled eshet amaretz. If you remember, we spoke about in Chot of Demai, a chaver, person who's trusted by the laws of Tumah and Tara, eno chaver, a person who's not. So the Mishnah says, Eshet chaver masheled eshet amaretz, the wife of a chaver, meaning the wife of somebody who carefully observes the laws of Tumah and tithing, can lend to the wife of an amaretz, somebody who's not careful in observing the laws, nafa uchvara, a sifter and a sieve. Now, the Tosfot Yonah explains this extends to a mill and an oven as well. And she can even sort grind and sift her produce together with her. Now, even though the Hamaretz might not tithe the food before she eats it, and you would be possibly helping her prepare forbidden food, it is still allowed. Now, Rabotai, as a background to explain, we know that the Torah prohibits a person to eat produce which you do not remove the proper tithings, the terumah, the maasrot. Such produce we call tevel, which we said was tavlo, meaning it's no good produce, right? Now, most Amei Aratzot do in fact tithe their produce, so according to the Torah, their food would be allowed. But the Chachamim decreed that a person cannot eat the produce of an Haaretz before tithing it himself. This is called demai, right? Which we learned earlier. It's a contraction of the words damai. What is the status of this food? Now, since the food is asur only midrabanan, the rabbis were more lenient in this case of helping the Eshet Haaretz prepare her food, more than in the previous case of helping Haaretz prepare Shemitah produce. Now, even though they prohibited helping an Haaretz sift and grind Shemitah produce, they allowed helping the Eshet Haaretz sift and grind ordinary produce. But once the Haaretz's wife adds water to the flour, you cannot touch it with her, which means you cannot help her knead it. Because you cannot assist those who are in the act of sinning. And the Mefarshim explain that when water is mixed into the flour, that dough becomes subject to the laws of challah, which we learned earlier, we spoke about a little bit earlier. Challah is the portion that has to be separated from the dough and given to the Kohen. Once the dough is formed, you cannot eat any part of it until the challah is removed. So at this point, it is forbidden to make the dough tameh, because as long as the dough still contains, in essence, challah, the dough is considered like challah in many aspects, and therefore, just like you cannot make challah tameh, which we learned from Sefer Dvarim, chapter 18, pasuk 8, you're not allowed to make this dough tameh as well. Now, in our case, since the Haaretz's wife and her utensils we assume to be tameh, you are going to commit the sin of making the dough tameh as she needs it. Therefore, the chaver's wife, this person who's trusted in the laws of tithing, his wife cannot help this Haaretz's wife knead the dough, because then she is actively assisting her in this isur. Now the Mishnah ends up permitting 3 acts in this whole Mishnah. Number 1, you're allowed to lend utensils to a woman who will probably use them to prepare forbidden Shemitah produce, as long as there's a possibility, even if it's a far-fetched possibility, that she will use it for something mutar. Number 2, you are allowed to lend utensils to Haaretz's wife who will probably use them to prepare food that might be in an untied state. And number 3, you are allowed to help an Haaretz's wife sort, grind, and sieve food that might be in an untied state. Now, according to the technical halacha, even these acts should be asur, because you cannot help somebody do any sin. But the Mishnah says, "V'kulan lo amru ela mipnei darkei shalom." The rabbi said that all these acts are permitted only for the sake of peace, meaning we want to limit discrimination against people suspected of violating the laws of Shemitah or the laws of Tumah and tithing. Now, the Mefarshim go at length to explain, even for the sake of keeping peace, the rabbis permitted only indirect assistance, like lending a sifter or a sieve. They did not allow direct assistance, like helping to grind and sieve Shemitah produce of an Haaretz and helping to knead the dough of an Haaretz. Also, they only permitted lending the utensils if there is a possibility, even if it's unlikely, that the buyer will use them for permitted purpose. If there would be no permitted purpose, it would be asur to lend it, even because of darkei shalom, even because of keeping the peace. Now the Rav says the Mishnah is going to quote a halakha that we said earlier in chapter 4, because since we're already talking about keeping the peace, we're going to say more halachot about keeping the peace. Right? We can give words of encouragement to idolaters who are working their own land in Eretz Yisrael on Shemitah, which we said earlier. For example, you can say, be successful, be strong, because since the idolaters are not obligated to keep the laws of Shemitah, we can encourage them while they work their fields, but not, even though we cannot help them. But we cannot encourage a Jew who is doing so, because we know on the contrary, you are obligated to rebuke a Jew to prevent them from breaking the law. We can greet idolaters by saying shalom, even though it's one of God's names, even under pagan holidays. Mipnei darkei shalom. All these acts are allowed for the sake of peace, to promote peace between Jews and non-Jews. Now, even though If not for the promotion of peace, we know it would be asur to encourage an idolater to do work that a Jew is not allowed to do. It would also be asur to greet an idolater with the word shalom, which is one of God's names, on this holiday, because he might commit the sin of thanking his pagan God for receiving this honor. But for the sake of peace, the Chachamim allowed these practices, and we explained earlier why is it so important to the Chachamim to promote peace. The Mefarshim explain that we always have to strive for peace between Jews and non-Jews, because we have to follow the ways of God, which Hashem says, Tov Hashem lakol v'achamav al kol ma'asav. Hashem is good to all, and He's merciful on all of His handiwork. And the pasuk also says, the ways of the Torah are ways of pleasantness, and all of its paths are peace. So for this reason, we also support non-Jews who are poor, we visit non-Jews who are sick, and we bury non-Jews who are in need of burial because of the ways of peace. That is the end of chapter 5. Perek Vav Mishnah Aleph is going to discuss now a new topic regarding where the laws of Shemitah apply. The laws of Shemitah, we know, only apply to those parts of Eretz Yisrael that were sanctified by the Jewish people. But there were two acts of sanctification in two different periods of history. The first one was performed by Yehoshua ben Nun, who led the nation into Eretz Yisrael after we left Yetziat Mitzrayim, when we left Egypt. This Kedusha, this sanctification, ended 800 years later when the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed and the people were sent in Galut to Babylonia. The land was sanctified again by Ezra. It's called Ole Bavel, by the people that came back from Bavel after the 7 years of exile. Now, Ezra's sanctification never ended, even after the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, but it is still in effect to today, as the Rambam says in Hilchot Bet HaBichira, chapter 6, Halakha 16, that it never ended. However, the problem is that not all the parts of Eretz Yisrael that were sanctified by Yehoshua were re-sanctified by Ezra. Therefore, the Shemitah laws in some parts of Eretz Yisrael are not the same in other parts. And let us read the Mishnah. Shalosh aratzot la-Sheviit. There are three lands with respect to the laws of Shemitah. Number one, Kol she'echziku ole Bavel me'eretz Yisrael ad Ksiv. All the territory taken by those who came up from Bavel, we call them Ole Bavel, those who came up, which extends from southern Eretz Yisrael to Ksiv in the north, they have the full sanctity of Eretz Yisrael. Lo ne'echal v'lo ne'evad. Therefore, its Shemitah produce cannot be eaten after the Biur deadline has passed, unless you performed the mitzvah of Biur, which we explained many times, and the land cannot be worked on Shemitah. Number two, V'kol she'echziku ole Mitzrayim mikziv v'ad nahar v'ad amana. All the territory taken by those who came up from Egypt, but not those that came up from Bavel, which include the area extending from Ksiv to the river in the east, which the Mefarshim explain, this is the northern stretch of the Euphrates, or other people explain I think it's Palfar River near Damascus. Right, again, so Kol she'echziku ole Mitzrayim Ksiv ad nahar v'ad amana. All the territory taken by those who came up from Mitzrayim, even though it wasn't sanctified by those who returned from Bavel, which include the area extending from Ksiv to the river in the east, and the area extending from Ksiv to Amana in the west, which is the Hor Haral mentioned in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 34, pasuk 7. This we treat like Eretz Yisrael to some degree. Ne'echal aval lo ne'evad. The Shemitah produce can be eaten without the Biur requirement having been fulfilled, but the land cannot be worked. And the Mefarshim explain, since the original sanctification of these areas by Yehoshua is no longer in force, because it wasn't re-sanctified by the Ole Bavel when Ezra came up from Babylonia, that which grows there during Shemitah can be eaten without Biur, but the Chachamim decreed that the land cannot be worked on Shemitah. They made a rabbinic decree. The third category, the third territory, Min Hanar u'me'amana v'lifnim. The territory that extends farther to the north from the river and Amana is not part of Eretz Yisrael at all. Ne'echal v'ne'evad, the Shemitah produce can be eaten without Biur and the land can be worked during the year of Shemitah. Rabotai, in order to clear it up, I recommend tremendously to look at the ArtScroll Elucidator. They gave a diagram exactly of which land was conquered by Ole Bavel, which one was conquered by Ole Mitzrayim. But again, there are three different territories in Eretz Yisrael regarding the laws. One territory has both laws of not eating it without bi'ur and not working it. One territory has not working it, but eating it without biur, and one territory has neither. You can eat it without biur and you can work it on the year of Shemitah. That is in Rabotai, today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen v'Amen.